Hello, I'm Richard Wilkins, and I want to talk about my blogger site on the Thames Goldfields. The link is given on the first picture, but I thought because it's a rather academic series of articles, I'll just have a fairly casual series of videos introducing the various subjects. There's about 10 of them I'll cover. They're all fairly academic, and I have to be a bit careful because I'm an academic by training, and I tend to lecture at people rather than give casual fireside chats. And just to clarify things, the dude who appears on the right is Commissioner Extraordinaire James Mackey, sometimes friend of the Maori, other times friend of the miners. Note, pronounced Mackey. So I'll do my best to keep it casual and fairly short. As you can see, there's about 10 things I will cover. Some of them have appeared elsewhere already, some have not. And we'll get through those in the next year or so. So, why the interest in Thames? Of course, I'm a Thames old boy. Great-grandfather, Richard Dick Ross, was one of the first gold miners. And he lived up on Eureka Hill, close to the Eureka Claim, all of his life in Thames, from 1867 until he died in 1935. King Dick, some people called him, only behind his back, I think. So the house they lived in, or the houses, was basically the same house all those years. The last person who left there was Joe Ross in 1967. So it's virtually a 100-year history. The house is in pretty bad repair now. In fact, it's not even there. Soon as Joe Ross left it, the growth took over and most things were stripped or just rotted. It's quite odd, the things you recall and recover. There's a few here, the old iron, the thing that sat on the stove for doing all the ironing. Odd things like this piece of wood, which was in the back porch, and all their washing up was done on that piece of wood for all those years. Quite odd, the things you remember. I was born in 1944 and spent my first few months up there before we moved to Thames. So Richard Ross was into gold his whole life up there. This stuff here, the magic quartz full of gold. Not overly successful, but got on well enough to survive modestly. There's a large family up there, probably about 14 altogether, dispersed all over the countryside now, with only fond memories of Thames. So how do we research Thames? Basically, apart from family knowledge, we need lots of books and other resources. There's probably a dozen or so that are really useful references, and a lot of information, fairly accurate, can be gleaned from those. I draw your attention to K. Lewis's book on the gold rush, covering the first few years. A lot of information, about 1,000 claims. And there's always more books appearing that you can get. This one here, I've just got. There's other books that are a bit more romantic or fictional and maybe have some information in them that's useful, other stuff that isn't. Apart from that, there's university or research type articles, and I draw your attention to the Hauraki reports, incredibly valuable, especially for Thames before the miners. A very good account of the trials and challenges that Maori went through at the time Europeans arrived. And don't forget in-house university publications. For instance, Philip Hart's series on gold mining in Hauraki, Waihi and Hiara are particularly well researched. Well, we've covered now all the formal written sources I've used. What do we do when we want to carry on and do some research of our own and write it up? I'll just go through the kinds of things that helped me. You may have different sources or a different approach, but essentially most of these are via the internet. First of all, there's sources that are explicitly on gold mining, particularly in Thames. I'll refer you to Gold Rush Online by Kay Lewis. This has a lot of details on early miners, thousands of them probably in Otago and Thames. Also, there's the Treasury Journal. We'll come back to the Treasury later. Again, that is edited by Kay Lewis. Her name appears quite a lot. Some good articles in there. Another one I found useful is the Hinamuri Journal. Now, this only goes up to about 2010, but there's a lot of detailed articles on mining, and they're very well edited. There's some articles in part of the past worth looking at, but that's a more general source of information on the Coromandel. Another very valuable source of information is Papers Past. This has newspaper reports on the early mining, particularly in the newspapers from Auckland and Thames. There's mining reports, mine managers' reports, and interesting enough, court cases. Court cases were held on mining disputes, etc., and they were very detailed. There's information in some of those articles you wouldn't find elsewhere. The other thing is a newspaper reporter could pop the share price up or down depending on what they wrote. And there were quite a few scams of various sorts, salting mines with gold dust, etc. A very interesting read. Another very useful source with a lot of general articles is Althea Barker's Thames NZ History and Genealogy pages. These are very, very comprehensive, and they can be searched. Then we come to things that are a bit more difficult to get into the nitty-gritty of. There's several places in Thames, which people will be familiar with, the Treasury, the School of Mines, Thames Museum, the Gold Mine Experience, and the Hauraki pump site. Well worth a visit, but you may not be able to delve too much into primary sources. The Treasury has an awful lot of stuff in their archives, but like many archives, not much of it is online, yet to be done. Another source that I was quite surprised about that's popped up recently is the UBIX group who explore old mines around the Coromandel. A hardy set of investigations delving into old mines, But some useful data has come out of that. They have a Facebook page. Another Facebook page that's interesting is Thames Historic Pictures. It's fairly easy to find your way around because the various topics are put into separate groups. There's one problem with Facebook pages. It's hard to index them so you can quickly find out what's in them. So, that's sources around Thames. Now, my favourite thing to look at is old photographs. And the best place is Digital New Zealand. They source some millions of items, and you can search it fairly easily with Thames, Monetary, Tauru, gold mining, etc. as keywords. And you get referred to the places that hold the photos. It could be Alexander Turnbull Library, Auckland Museum, Auckland Libraries, etc. Now, the better photos are very, very high quality. And as you can see on this one of Daniel Mundy, Grahamstown, 1870, with careful attention, you can pick out individual buildings, identify them and where they are. Very, very useful. And I'll come back to photos as a mainstay of my articles in the future. Another thing that is very useful is old maps and plans. A little hard to access. A lot of them have been destroyed or lost or filed somewhere where you can't find them. The best place to go is Archives New Zealand, although there are some in the Treasury, in Thames Museum, and probably other places too. Archives New Zealand is a bit hard to navigate around, to put it mildly, but you can find things. The downside is, if you want to order something, you don't know quite what you're getting because there's no little thumbnail image of it, and it costs you $25 an item. It soon gets expensive. You can visit Archives New Zealand in Auckland or elsewhere, or the Alexander Turnbull Library, etc., etc. But these days, it's rather difficult to get easy access by going into their old historic stacks. You really have to organise your visit, and it's probably quite difficult to look at a large amount of stuff very quickly. That's where it's very different from the old days of 30 years ago, where various researchers could just wander into these places and more or less be given free rein, go through photos, etc., make copies, put them in books, and you never know where they got them from because they didn't have proper referencing systems. Maps, mainly from Archives New Zealand. These can give quite a bit of detail on various mining sites. Here's an example of the Wild Missouri Battery, where you can see various surveying data which supposedly locates accurately the site of the battery. I've found that many of these so-called surveys are not as accurate as you'd think, but reasonably so. If you collect enough of these, you get a good idea of the layout of an area. Some of the other maps that have been published, for example, this one by Pullman, are surprisingly accurate. And in fact, this one in some areas is more accurate than some of the supposed survey plans. So that's a quick run through internet accessed resources. What about a visit to Thames and the old sites? Unfortunately, this is quite a difficult endeavour these days. The main reason is that the regrowth in the hills behind Thames has been quite dramatic in the last 40 years or so. Until then, as you can see in these old aerial photographs, 1944, there was large areas of bare or semi-bare land, just mullock piles, etc. And you could look around these areas fairly freely and identify old features. In the last 50 years, this has changed dramatically. And now there's basically regrowth covering everything. Just to give you some idea of how much this has happened, here's an example of Coronary Hill, a photo I took in 1982. Actually, the pile of mullocky stuff in front of me was not through mining. The culprit was the Thames Borough Council. For some reason, they bulldozed the top of the hill. Anyway, compare that photo with this one taken 40 years later. The mullocky stuff is semi-covered, but note in the distance the incredible growth of pine trees. The hills just behind Thames are covered with these nuisance pine trees everywhere. Not native growth, blasted pine trees, which have more or less taken over. If we go up a bit further into the Monotari Valley, here's an area around Station 7 of the Monotari Tramway. You can see in 1944, a big pile of mullocky stuff where the trucks on the tramway spilt mullock and other ore. Go forward to the year 2000, and if you look carefully on the aerial photo, you can see the growth over that big mullock pile is different from the rest of the vegetation. And photos taken on the ground show there's a fairly odd covering of vegetation. Things do not grow well on mullock, but it does get covered, often with gorse and weeds as much as anything else. Probably the last person who got a good look around was Neville Ritchie, around 1990, who did a big survey of mining sites through the Coromandel. And he was able to identify a lot of old remains of mining, both equipment and shafts, tunnels, etc., with reasonable ease. But in 30 years, a lot of that would be impossible. So there's a quick run through some of the things to look at, and my next series of videos will actually give you the results of my research and studies. Thank you.